This is an episode of Unconfined, the podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. Unconfined is a podcast about industrial food animal production and its emerging alternatives. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produces our theme music. Your hosts are me, Tom Philpott, and Christine Grillo. Paulette Wilson is our producer, and Natalie Wood-Wright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future. Welcome, everyone, to this very special edition of Unconfined Podcast. We have with us a celebrity in the world of global food policy. I would love to introduce you to Shakuntala Haraksingh Thilsted, who is the Director for Nutrition, Health, and Food Security Impact Platform at CGIR, which is an extremely important worldwide network of agricultural research centers that grew out of the Green Revolution effort in the 1970s and is still going strong today. Shakuntala was the winner of the 2021 World Food Prize, which is an extremely prestigious award. Welcome to our offices in Baltimore and to Unconfined Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, and it is a pleasure to be here with you.
Wonderful. I wonder if we could start, if you could tell me a little bit. So, you're from the island nation of Trinidad, and you grew up in a fourth generation household. And I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about how your upbringing influenced your move into the world of food policy.
Well, in my generation, when I, as a woman, as a young girl, would be going to school, if you were interested in science and doing well in science, there was just one field that and your parents had the money to send you to university.
Right.
Then there was just one field that was open to you, and that's medicine.
Right.
And I said to everyone, I was different. I wanted to do something different. And I said, yes, I will study science, but not medicine. And I said, I'd like to study agriculture. And that was a big, big shock for my family. But I persevered. Well, what helped also was the fact that I had a scholarship. So no one had to pay for me to go to university. So I had the right to choose. And I chose agriculture and studied agriculture for my bachelor degree at the University of the West Indies. Got married, went on to Denmark and studied physiology and biochemistry, and slowly shifted towards food and nutrition, which I've done for many years and which I greatly enjoy.
And I understand that your household had a very strong food tradition within it, correct?
Yes, I think that's strong in my time, that's strong in many Indian families, and I'm from an Indian Hindu family, so it's extremely strong. A lot of time would be spent by the women in the family on sourcing foods, preparing foods, feeding children. Much energy and time goes into that, and that's considered a big part of the family tradition. And there's this close relation of the importance of food for growing well and for being strong and smart.
Which is a very strong basis to take into nutrition as a practitioner.
And also when I've worked a lot in the field with communities, and when you see that these traditions playing out in communities and what it means for families and what they would like to give to their children, it's extremely strong.
So to sort of step back a little bit and look at a bigger picture, the Green Revolution, in its origins, its first couple of decades, really focused on a few commodity crops and really focused on increasing yields, essentially quantity. And one of your messages has been that quality is just as important. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that progression.
Well, that in the time of the Green Revolution, amazing advances were made. We talked and could see pictures of people dying of hunger and having crops, major staple crops, which now could reach to many more people, abated hunger and death. But we've moved beyond that. So in the past, where we would talk about feeding the hungry, now we've moved to nourishing people, and we've also moved further with sustainability and thereby nourishing people and nourishing our planet at the same time. So that progression has meant a lot for where we are today in terms of nourishing and the many different forms we are seeing of malnourishment. It's not just hunger, but it's also malnourishment in the form of hidden hunger, which is less having too little micronutrients, minerals and vitamins and other essential nutrients in your diet. And sadly also, it's also the issues we are seeing with overnutrition and obesity in many parts of the world. So the issues we have to face and the issues that we have to find solutions to are quite different today than they were in the past. And luckily, there are scientific advances and solutions which now can answer to all these diverse issues we face, with not just making sure people do not go hungry, but ensuring that they eat diverse, nutritious foods which nourish them.
Right, because the original emphasis on a few staple crops was good for alleviating hunger, but it maybe brought us into this world of overabundance and these problems of overnutrition, like too many calories but not enough nutrients.
So, well, there are many issues, much that has changed. In the past, if you would look at populations, especially population groups in rural areas, and look at the necessity for energy in terms of the hard labor, the ways of living at that time. So the energy requirements were much higher than they are today. And which means that we also have to change the ways we combine and compose our diets. Less energy, but ensuring that the essential micronutrients, the minerals and the vitamins are found in the food. Another change we have had is if we look at diets in the past to diets today, we have a greater proportion, a greater amounts of oil in the diet. And oil is very high energy. And if you do not need that amount of energy because of reduced physical activity, then again, we need to ensure that there's much more diversity of different foods on the plate, perhaps less staple foods, certainly in many parts of the world, less fats, less oils in the diet, and much more fruit and vegetables.
Now, one thing that you're very known for, and it's mentioned in the World Food Prize, writing about you, is your work in Bangladesh and with pond polyculture. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and talk about, when you started working there and how smallholders were encouraged to manage ponds, I guess to create tilapia, as I understand it, and what kind of practices they were using and what were some of your insights for how that was going.
So, as you mentioned with the Green Revolution, much of that was built on monocropping. And that way of growing food and trying to get abundance of foods in terms of just quantity is monocropping also in waters. So, for example, in Bangladesh, with household ponds and inland water bodies, it was looking just at the production and for example, taking into consideration few large fish varieties, for example, carp species, and tilapia that can grow big and that you can grow in monoculture. If you look at the diversity of fish species, well, if now we are talking about Bangladesh, there are many hundreds of species of just fish, not just thinking about aquatic foods in general, but just fish species in Bangladesh. And I like to give this story that if you would go to a village in Bangladesh, even today, and gather children around you and ask them to name fish species, in no time, in minutes, you would get between 50 to 100 names. I wonder if we would do this in a school here.
I think you might get 3 or 4 at the most.
At the most.
Yeah.
Okay. So that tells you something about the diversity and the use of different fish species in Bangladesh. And then I realized also that the production systems were set up, as I said, for increasing quantity and increasing production in terms of sale of fish. So I try to look at systems whereby you can combine sale, because of course all farmers need to earn a living, but at the same time that there are fish being produced that that people would like to eat, that have many micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, and also that women would like to cook and feed to their children. And in doing a pond polyculture with both large and small indigenous fish species, then you have both, then you win on both fronts. Not only that, aquaculture was considered a man's world, but having this mixed aquaculture and polyculture, then women were more engaged in aquaculture. They got more agency at household level in selling the fish, in cooking the fish, in taking care of the fish in the ponds. And the production system was better in that you had a higher productivity, but at the same time, a higher nutritional quality of the total production system. And one also big advantage in having a pond polyculture of indigenous small fish and large fish was that you did not have to clean the ponds. So it reduced the need of using a pesticide for cleaning the ponds, and it also reduced the amount of feed that was needed to feed the fish. So there were, you won on many fronts. So it was not just on the production, but it was the whole system that was used at household level.
And I guess the idea, in that period was that the small fish would compete with the large fish, and so you had to.
That was a big issue where we first had to do experiments and very documented experiments with. I started with 10 ponds, and to demonstrate that there was no competition between the different fish species in the pond.
And you've done work that shows that, let's say, a pound of tilapia versus a pound of these sort of indigenous wild fish, the nutritional components of the the wild fish are much more dense, right?
Yes. Well, and that relates to the type of feeding. The the type of fish species, but very much so to how the fish is consumed. So if you would have small fish species, the whole fish is consumed. The bones are soft and edible. So you're eating the eyes, the head, the organs, and these parts of the fish are much more dense than just the fillet. So that makes a lot of the difference also. It's not so it's yes, it's the type, the species itself, but it's also how is it used and which parts of the fish are consumed.
And these parts that we discard in sort of Western, the Western sort of way of doing fish are extremely dense in all kinds of nutrients.
Yes.
And I guess omega-3 fatty acids as well.
Yes. So it would be, in many parts of the world, in Asia, in Africa, these small fish species, because you have the season of plenty and the scarce season. So in the season of plenty, these can be dried and used as dried fish, which is extremely important in Asia and Africa, because you do not have the facilities for cooling or for freezing as you have in richer countries. So by drying the fish, you can keep it for a longer time. When it's sold in the market, it's accessible to many more people because you can buy a small amount. You don't have to buy a whole big fish. And you can keep it at room temperature in the jar. And then if you have it dried or perhaps better yet, powdered, it can be used to add to dishes for any family member or in the household.
And this isn't this might be a hard sell in the United States that we're going to consume this kind of thing, but it's not a hard sell in a place like Bangladesh, right?
But it shouldn't be a hard sell anyway.
Yeah.
Because just look at the school feeding programs, how milk powder has dominated school feeding programs all over the world, in all countries, even in countries where milk is not consumed or produced. And if you would take some of these powders from small fish, or for that matter from seaweed, these are much more nutritious than milk powder. So we should be looking at ways to shift out some of the foods that we use, for example, in school feeding programs, and add much more nutrient-dense foods to that. And where small fish, dried small fish, fish powder, seaweed powder would be really excellent choices. If you would go to programs in Korea or Japan, where you have a tradition for eating diverse aquatic foods, there you would see how important it is and what a role it plays in many programs. Just think, for example, if you would take, hospital meals and school meals and wanting to make them more nutritious, then there will be spaces for products like these.
And you're talking about what could potentially be a very abundant supply of a very low, low input kind of aquaculture.
Yes.
And so since your work sort of took root in Bangladesh, are you seeing a change in the way people manage these ponds?
Well, Bangladesh has many millions. I wouldn't know, but at that time we were over 4 million ponds, and this is because it's a lowland. So when you build your house in Bangladesh, or you build your residence in Bangladesh, you would try to elevate the area where you would be establishing your home, and where you take the soil for elevating that area becomes a pond.
Right.
So there are many, many homestead ponds that can be used. But I've also worked in many other countries of Odisha and Assam, and here the government has changed its policy. So, for example, in Odisha, the state in India, the policy has been changed. So now dried small fish are included in school meals,
Wow.
are included in take-home rations for pregnant and lactating women, adolescent girls, and are included in the meals that are served in healthcare centers. So there is much we can do, and there is much we can do to ensure that the foods that are used in many programs, the government programs, because these are government programs, but in hospitals, used in prisons, there's much we can do to ensure that we nourish people and ensure that that much more diverse foods and foods that are rich in micronutrients are used in many different programs.
And is there a terrestrial component to the polyculture, the pond polyculture?
There is, because what I started with was nearly all homesteads with a pond would also have a kitchen garden, and there are also crops that are grown on the dikes of the ponds. So, um, working together with partners, I was the first to introduce orange sweet potato, vitamin A rich sweet potato, grown on the banks of ponds, and other green leafy vegetables are grown. Other vegetables are grown, because we do know, when you study nutrition, you do know that a plate of food must be diverse and must be combined of many different foods. Of course, the staple and vegetables are in Bangladesh. After the staple, which is rice, the next most common food group would be vegetables, and the third would be fish.
And Bangladesh has seen tremendous gains in, fighting back food insecurity in recent decades, right?
Yes. But still, very much, the production system is very much focused on rice production.
Okay.
And also there, few high-yielding varieties. And now there is a move back to looking at the many different varieties of rices, but also looking at other types of foods that are grown on land, making the production system much more diverse.
Yeah, so we've moved away from the Green Revolution idea of we need one high yielding rice that everyone can grow that will, end hunger that way, and we realize that that's not really going to solve problems long term. And I guess there are polycultures within rice agriculture too, right?
Yes. And very much so in wetlands area, because remember, you go to many crops, you go to many countries, you have seasons of rain, seasons of drought, and then when there is rain, there is water everywhere. So even the rice fields become wetlands in which you can produce different types of fish species.
Right. So you can integrate fish in, and this is an idea that goes back millennia.
I mean, just go to Japan or China and look at how food was grown in the past. I do think we need much, and we need to do more. We are not yet there where we should be in terms of diversity, and now we know, and it's acknowledged, the benefits of diversity, not just for humans, for the soil, for everything that we do.
And I guess we saw, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously this is the Black Sea, which is a place where a lot of wheat, which is a very important global commodity crop, and a lot of the world gets a lot of its calories from wheat. And when the prices spiked, you can see people maybe who live on the edge of food security plunging into food insecurity. And did that event, this obviously ongoing event, did that sort of hasten this idea that we need to reinvest in agriculture in places like Bangladesh and increase diversity and sustainability?
You brought up a really important point, because we've seen with COVID, with the wars and conflicts in many parts of the world, that food prices have hiked, fertilizer prices have hiked, fuel prices have also hiked, and all this will affect the poorest in any community in whether they are food secure or food insecure. So this is a big issue that's facing the world, and at a global scale, it's quite dire because it means that the projections we made up to the Sustainable Development Goals of zero hunger and zero malnutrition by 2030, that we aren't going to get to that point. Of course, we shouldn't give up in our fight. We should ensure that we get as furthest as possible. But we aren't going to reach zero hunger and zero malnutrition. So there's much more that needs to be done and needs to be done quickly. And if you would ask me from my point of view, if I would give one word as to how we can get there, still keep on the fight and still fight towards reaching zero hunger and zero malnutrition, the one word I would choose would be diversity. Diversity of systems, diversity of production systems, diversity of foods on the plate.
And diversity of sources. Like, you want a global market in, these important staple crops.
Yes.
But we can't just have a global market because there are these disruptions, there are these price hikes.
Well, if we would use, I come from the West Indies, I come from Trinidad and Tobago. If you would use large ocean states as an example, for example, islands in the Caribbean or islands in the Pacific, we do know that more and more food is being imported into these countries, and there is both a need and the possibility of growing more local foods and having more local foods in the diets, which would make them cheaper and also more nutritious.
And it goes back to your one word of diversity. There's a diversity of sources. There's a global market, but there's also the local, from the pond level on up, and the household level on up.
Which also benefits producers in local communities.
And I'm guessing this idea of taking the small fish from the abundant season when they're overabundant in terms of consumption at that moment and drying them, that provides another income stream to these household producers.
And especially for women, because if you would go to Africa or to Asia, the women are engaged in the drying of fish.
And if there's a local market for it, then it just builds robustness in the local food economy. Now, I know that you don't usually focus on the United States. Your work is very much in the global South, but you have been spending some time here, I understand. And I wonder what you think of the very marginal place of aquatic foods in the American diet. If you look at per capita, consumption data, we consume more than 200 pounds of meat per year in America, and I think that the seafood consumption by comparison is in the teens. What do you think about that, and how could we change it, do you think?
Well, I think much more could be done in the educational system, with children, and with, again, school meals. If you would create a space where there is much more diversity, where children are taught about the values of diverse foods, including aquatic foods, I do think you could create a space that can change behavior. And it would be good to focus on school children, because you are not just feeding the one meal, you are changing behavior that can last a lifetime.
And generations.
Yes. If I would give an example with my granddaughter who lives in Denmark, she is 3 years old, and most parents, both the males and females, work in Denmark. So all children are in daycare institutions away from home. And in the nursery, they will be served the midday meal. And I asked my granddaughter, who is 3, I said, how do you know? What do you get to eat? She said, we serve ourselves. We go to the table and there are lots of different kinds of foods, and we take our food ourselves. And then I said, oh, so how do you do that? What do you know? What should you be taking? And she says, well, there's one rule. We must have a rainbow plate. So that's a lesson.
Yes.
And
it's a principle that you can teach.
Principle that you can teach that would, as you say, last the generation and even the generations to come. So there is much that we can do by changing perceptions, changing behavior, and changing knowledge. And so many ask me, for example, oh, but it takes too much time to source foods. It takes too much time to make diverse foods. It takes too much time in the kitchen to clean up if you're cooking vegetables and cooking many diverse foods. So I said, yes, but there's one principle we can build on and one idea we can build on. All parents want their children, as my grandmother did, to be smart and healthy. And if we give the message of the importance of diverse foods for being smart and healthy, I do think we can change behavior.
Well, I think that is an amazing note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on Unconfined Podcast, and enjoy the rest of your time in Baltimore.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu.